Growing up in northern Pennsylvania, you learn pretty early on that the woods are not just a place to look at from your window. I lived in a small town called Wellsboro. It is a quiet place, completely surrounded by state game lands, where life moves at a different pace. Around there, hunting season is not just a hobby, it is practically a holy month. It is a big deal to the point where local schools would actually shut down on the first day of rifle season. The reason was simple. Half the town, including the teachers and the students, would be out in the woods before sunrise. My dad got me into hunting when I was about 12 years old, teaching me how to respect the land and stay safe. By the time I turned 23, I was going out alone regularly. This happened during the late archery season in November of 2021. There was already a light dusting of snow on the ground, which made it easier to track movement. I had permission to hunt a large piece of private land owned by an older guy my dad knew from work. The property was around 70 acres of thick woods with a small clearing and an old logging trail running through it. There was also an abandoned hunting cabin way back in the woods that nobody used anymore because the roof was starting to cave in. I had been there maybe 4 or 5 times before and never saw anyone else. That morning, I got there around 5:15 while it was still completely dark. I parked my truck where I always did near a rusted gate and walked in with my headlamp on. The woods were dead quiet. I remember having this weird feeling like I was being watched before I even got to my stand, but I just blamed it on being alone in the dark like always. I climbed into my tree stand about 20 feet up and waited for daylight. About an hour after sunrise, I noticed something that immediately bothered me. About 60 yards away, I saw another tree stand that had not been there before. I knew the property pretty well, and I was certain it had not been there the previous weekend. It was one of those cheap ladder stands, and it looked old and weathered, like it had been sitting somewhere for years, but I would have noticed it before. What bothered me more was that there were no footprints leading to it in the snow, except for one single trail of prints that went from deep in the woods straight to the base of the stand. I watched it for a while, thinking maybe someone else had permission to hunt there and just never mentioned it. Then, around 8 in the morning, I saw a sudden movement near that newly placed stand. My heart jumped. At first, my brain wanted it to be a deer, but I was dead wrong. As I focused my eyes, I saw it was a person standing right behind a large tree next to the ladder stand. This person was not wearing any hunter orange or camouflage. He was wearing a dirty, faded gray hoodie and dark pants. He was standing completely still, and his head was turned directly toward me. He was looking right at me. I did not know if he could actually see me up in my stand at first, but then he slowly lifted his right arm and gave a wave. It was not a friendly, enthusiastic wave. It was a slow, deliberate movement, like he was just letting me know that he had spotted me. I felt extremely uncomfortable, but I did not want to cause trouble, so I gave a small, quick wave back. I figured maybe he was just some local guy who did not have the proper hunting gear but was out exploring. After about a minute of just standing there, he stepped back behind the large tree. I kept my eyes glued to that spot, expecting him to walk out from the other side or head down the trail. But he never came out. I waited and watched for what felt like an eternity, but there was no further movement. I figured he must have slipped away deeper into the thick brush, even though I had not heard a single twig snap. Around 10, I climbed down to stretch my legs and walk around a little. I walked toward where I saw him. When I got to the tree he had been standing behind, I saw that the snow around the tree was completely undisturbed except for my own tracks. There were no tracks leading away, just the same single line of footprints I saw earlier, leading toward the ladder stand. I followed those prints, and they stopped right at the base of the stand. I looked up, but it was empty. The seat had a thin layer of undisturbed snow on it. That made no sense. I felt my chest get tight, like something was very wrong. I decided to head back toward my own stand. On the way back, I noticed a strip of orange hunting vest material tied to a branch. Then I saw another one about 15 feet away, and then another. They were tied at different heights, like someone had been marking something pretty specifically. Around noon, I went back to my truck to eat. Nothing happened, but I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched from the tree line. I almost left, but I convinced myself I was just overthinking things. I went back in around 2 in the afternoon to sit until dark. This is where things got bad. About an hour before sunset, I heard what sounded like slow footsteps behind me in the leaves. They were too heavy and spaced out to be an animal. I turned to face them, expecting to see another hunter. About 30 yards behind my stand, I saw the same guy from earlier. This time he was closer, and I could see his face better. His beard looked patchy and dirty, and his skin looked pale, like he had not been outside in daylight in weeks. What really bothered me was that he was smiling, but not in a normal way. He was just barely showing his teeth. He was holding something in his right hand, which at first I thought was a stick until seeing the little yellow and black handle. It was a screwdriver. He did not say anything. He chose to just stare me down with that half smile. I asked if he had permission to be on the property, but he did not answer. After maybe 10 seconds of this heart-pounding stare-off, he slowly turned and walked away into the trees. That should have been the moment I left. However, I made the stupid decision to stay until shooting light ended. Right after sunset, I climbed down and started walking back fast. In that moment, I remember regretting not leaving while I still had some light in the sky. About halfway to my truck, I started noticing the orange cloth strips again, but this time, they were not just on branches. Some were tied to small sticks pushed into the ground. But the thing that genuinely scared me was one of the sticks had something hanging from it. It was a dead squirrel. It had been hung by a wire through its back legs. I may be a hunter, but I do not condone needless suffering of animals. Under the squirrel and stick, in the snow, someone had drawn a rough circle with a boot. That was the second time I seriously considered running. As I kept walking, I started noticing more of them. Not just squirrels, a rabbit, a crow, all hung the same way, like markers or maybe a threat. I started walking faster. About 100 yards from my truck, I saw something leaning against a tree that made me stop completely. It was my backpack, the one I had left in my tree stand earlier that day. I never brought it back down with me. It was zipped open, and my stuff was laid out in the snow, including my knife, my flashlight, and my extra arrows. They were all lined up neatly like someone had taken inventory. That was the moment of realization, that someone had been close enough to my stand to climb it without me knowing. I grabbed my stuff fast and jogged the rest of the way. When I got to the clearing where my truck was, I had another unexpected encounter. It was like it just did not stop. My driver's side door was open. I know I locked it because I always do. Nothing inside looked stolen, but my registration papers were sitting on the passenger seat instead of the glove box. I got in and locked the doors, and as I started the truck, I looked in the mirror toward the tree line. There he was, standing just inside the woods, maybe 40 yards away, the guy in the hoodie. From what I could tell, he was still smiling. This time he raised his hand again, but instead of waving, he just pointed at me. Then he slowly dragged his finger across his own throat. I left so fast I spun gravel all the way back to the main road. I told the property owner what happened, and he said nobody else had permission to be there. He contacted the game commission. About 2 weeks later, he called my dad and said, officers found a makeshift shelter deep on the property made from tarps and old wood. Inside, they found animal bones and stolen hunting gear from other properties. I never hunted there again. I do not hunt alone anymore either, definitely not in grounds I am not familiar with. Anything can happen when you are all alone out there. Yet, as you are about to find out, sometimes even having family with you isn't enough to make you feel safe. This next story takes place in November of last year, when I was on a hunting trip with my grandpa to Crockett, Texas. I don't really get to see my grandpa that often because he owns his own company and works long hours. So, when he told me he wanted to go hunting, I was more than happy to go with him. I will say I personally don't like hunting at all, but I love to camp and explore. And I had never been to this particular lease he was taking us to, so I figured why not. I love exploring new places, so I took a few days off from work and went down to Crockett with him. As we pulled up to the gate, I noticed there wasn't a real entryway like most places I've been to in the past. It was just a dirt track with an iron gate on the side of a busy state freeway. My grandpa got out of the truck to lift the heavy gate, and then we headed down a long, bumpy dirt road through the thick woods until we reached a clearing with an old house in the middle. While we were heading toward the house, he told me his father had built it, and they used it to go hunting or just relax and take a break from life. I could definitely see the appeal. It was incredibly peaceful inside the woods, and I could barely hear the cars from the freeway. It seemed like the perfect getaway for the weekend, or so I thought at the time. After we pulled into the driveway, we unpacked the truck and cooked some dinner for the night. Everything seemed completely normal. There were old beds where we put sheets and blankets, an old TV with a VCR, and the kitchen stove was particularly old-fashioned as well. After we finished eating, we went to sleep around 8:30 so we could wake up just before dawn to go to one of the blinds. As I started to fall asleep, I heard a faint scratching noise coming from one of the windows with a wire screen on it. I didn't think anything of it and fell asleep fairly soon after that, assuming it was just some branches brushing against the wall. The next morning, my grandpa woke me up to get dressed so we could head out to the blind. After we got there, we settled in and surveyed the clearing through the windows. We didn't see anything for a couple of hours, so we decided to take a little nap. I woke up after only being asleep a few minutes and took my binoculars to look closely at the far tree line. The tree line was about 1.5 miles from the blind. I swear to God, I spotted someone peeking around the trees right at the edge of the woods like they knew we were there. It was almost as if they had been watching us the entire time. I was thoroughly convinced someone was watching us, so I woke up my grandpa immediately. He took the binoculars and looked through them toward the tree line, but right then, a herd of deer came out into the middle of the clearing. He just chuckled and told me there was nothing to worry about, and that it was just wildlife playing tricks on my eyes. I was irritated, to say the least. I know exactly what I saw, and it looked like a person, or at least some kind of figure. After about 30 minutes, he shot one of the deer, and we took it back to the house to clean it and start skinning it. After we gutted the deer, it was about 3 in the afternoon, and we decided what we wanted for dinner, but we realized we needed to head into town to get some supplies. So we hung the deer up on the wooden stand and left for the store. When we got back a while later, we saw claw and bite marks all over the animal's body. My grandpa and I just looked at each other in complete shock. He looked at me and said we were going on a night hunt. I asked him what for, and he told me he thought it was coyotes, but I didn't think that was the case. This didn't seem normal at all. After we ate, we grabbed some flashlights and our rifles and went out scouting into the dark woods. We were talking in low voices for a solid 45 minutes before we heard anything at all. We got really close to the tree line, and I suddenly turned and saw something peeking out at us again from behind a pine tree. The second it realized I noticed it, it quickly hid back in the shadows. I tried everything in my power not to scream for my grandpa, so I did a light, quiet whistle to him and waved him over to where I saw it. He whispered for me to stay put and watch his back. He walked into the dark woods with his gun raised and quickly disappeared into the pitch black. I stood there for what felt like forever, waiting to hear something, anything. After about 10 minutes I heard a sharp gunshot. I ran into the woods and saw a dead coyote with a mutilated deer next to it. I breathed a sigh of relief seeing my grandpa was okay, but he told me the coyote had noticed him and looked like it was about to attack, so he had no choice but to fire his weapon. We sat there for a moment in the silence before we heard a sudden rustling in the distance, followed by the most horrifying, blood-curdling scream I've ever heard in my life. It wasn't human, and it was definitely not any animal I recognized, but I didn't care to find out. We booked it back to the house as fast as we could while hearing intense, heavy footsteps and ragged breathing coming from right behind us. It felt like we would never make it back, but we did. We slammed the heavy wooden doors shut and locked every entrance we could. All we heard were weird screeching sounds and heavy breathing right outside the door on the porch. Whatever it was began to get frustrated and slammed against the door a couple of times, making the frame rattle. My grandpa got tired of being scared and shot through the door a couple of times with his rifle. It must have hurt whatever was on the other side, because it made that terrifying screech again and then ran away into the woods. As soon as we could catch our breath, I called the police and told them what happened. They were obviously skeptical of the story, but when the deputy arrived, he didn't know what to think either. We showed him everything we found, including the bullet holes and the bite marks. He seemed pretty unsettled by it too. Nothing ever came back from that call, but needless to say, we probably won't ever be going back to that house again. Sometimes the things that watch you from the tree line are not easily explained, and they are certainly not friendly. And as my friends and I would find out a few years later, some screams in the dark are designed to lure you in. Kyle had been asking Connor and me for 2 years to go hunting with him, and we always brushed it off because neither of us really knew what we were doing, and hunting was never something I was interested in. Kyle was the kind of guy who actually knew how to do things, though. He knew how to gut a deer, split wood, start a fire without lighter fluid, and look comfortable sleeping on the ground. Connor and I were not those kinds of guys. We liked the idea of a hunting trip more than the reality of it. Sitting around drinking in the mountains for a weekend sounded good. Hiking miles into the woods, waking up before sunrise, and killing an animal did not. But Kyle finally talked us into it late one November. He said rifle season was open, and the weather would be cold enough to keep the bugs down. He knew a spot in the mountains where he had hunted before, and almost never saw anyone else. To be honest, he mainly convinced us with the food and beer part in the middle of the mountains. The plan was simple. We would drive up Friday morning, hike in, set up camp, and spend the weekend hunting. Connor agreed because he liked a good story, and I agreed because I didn't want to be left out. We loaded Kyle's truck before sunrise and drove a few hours into the mountains. Kyle kept talking us through everything like we were in a beginner class. He showed us how to keep the rifles pointed safe, how to walk quietly, what deer sign looked like, and how to spot little trails through thick woods that I never would have noticed on my own. After parking at a pull-off near an old logging road, we hiked in for what felt like 10 miles. By the time we got there, my shoulders were sore and my legs were shaking on the steeper parts. We found a flat spot near a small creek and set up camp. Kyle did most of the work because Connor and I were useless. By the time it got dark, we had the tents up, a fire going, and a ring of logs to sit on. That first night felt perfect for a while. The woods were dead quiet except for the fire popping and the creek moving over the rocks. We were drinking beers, talking about high school, and making fun of how bad Connor was at putting up a tent. It was an amazing moment. I remember thinking I understood why people liked this. Then, out of the blue, we heard a scream somewhere, deep in the woods. We all stopped talking. Kyle tilted his head and listened, while Connor laughed and said it sounded like a woman getting murdered. Kyle said it could be a fox. He said, "Foxes make sounds like a screaming woman." I wanted that to be true, because that scream didn't sound like a fox to me. Because it was so far away, it was easy to tell ourselves it was an animal. After a minute or two, we started talking again, though not as relaxed. Every one of us kept pausing to listen, even Kyle. About 5 minutes later, the scream came again. However, this time it was so much closer that the conversation died instantly. It sounded like it came from maybe a football field away. It was loud enough that there was no joking around after that one. It sounded exactly like a woman screaming. One long scream that ended all at once. Connor stood up and stared into the dark beyond the firelight. Kyle got to his feet too. Connor called out, asking if someone needed help. I told him that was stupid, and then we just listened for an answer. Nothing came back. Kyle looked uncomfortable. He said if it was a person, they would have answered. He said we needed to kill the fire and get into the tents. It was obvious why. The fire was basically a marker showing exactly where we were. We put the fire out fast and climbed into our tents with our rifles. I barely slept. Every little noise my brain picked up on. I must have passed out anyway, because when I woke up it was gray outside and freezing. When the urge to pee got too bad, I stepped out of the tent. Right away I noticed our chairs were tipped over, and a cooler was turned sideways. A grocery bag with snacks was torn open and dragged. Kyle's backpack was lying near the fire ring when it had been against a tree when we went to bed. I called for Kyle and Connor, and they came out half awake. Kyle looked around and said a bear had probably come through. That made sense. We hadn't hung everything, and there had been food smells all over camp. The weird thing was that not much was gone. Stuff was moved around more than eaten or stolen. Still, Kyle sounded confident, and I wanted a normal explanation. He said we should move camp deeper into the woods to get away from the bear and get closer to where he planned to hunt. So, we packed up and moved. The second site was farther from the creek in a thicker patch of woods along a slope. It felt a lot more isolated. We hunted most of that day. Kyle split us up but kept us within sight, showing us where to sit and watch. Connor treated it like a game, but by mid-afternoon even he had settled down. There is something about sitting in the woods for hours with a rifle that changes your mood. Late in the day, Kyle shot a deer. It happened fast. I heard the crack of the rifle, and then Kyle yelling. When Connor and I got to him, the deer was down in a patch of brush about 40 yards away. It was a decent-sized buck. Seeing a dead deer up close was different than in a photo. Kyle had us drag it back to camp, which was miserable. Once there, he started field dressing it, showing us how to skin and break it down. Connor acted interested, but I could tell he was forcing it. I felt sick. The smell was awful, and the whole thing felt brutal. I grew up an animal lover, so the idea of me on a hunting trip was crazy. Kyle was in his element, explaining every part like a class. By the end, there were chunks of meat in the cooler and a bloody mess off to the side. That night we drank again, partly to celebrate, and partly because we needed it after helping with the deer. Kyle cut off some backstrap and cooked it over the fire. It tasted good. As a surprisingly good day was coming to a close, the scream came back. It was distant at first, maybe even farther than the first night, but the second I heard it, I felt that same dread. We all knew that sound now. Nobody said fox. Nobody laughed. Kyle stared off into the dark. Connor muttered that there was no way this was happening again. We waited and hoped. It wasn't over. A few minutes later, the scream came again, much closer, and this time it sounded like it was moving toward us. It was fully dark, and the firelight made everything beyond look blacker. I felt that whoever was making that sound could see us perfectly, even though we couldn't see anything past the trees. Kyle stood up and grabbed his rifle. He was trying to act calm, but I could hear him curse. Then, in a burst of drunk confidence, he raised the rifle and fired a few rounds into the air. Right after, he started yelling into the woods like a maniac, trying to sound bigger and crazier than whoever was out there. Connor and I laughed, mostly because it was sudden and ridiculous, and because our nerves were mixed with stupid energy. But the laughter didn't last because a moment later, the scream came again, even closer. Close enough that it sounded like it was just a few yards outside the edge of camp, right beyond where the firelight stopped. Kyle stopped yelling right away. We all realized that if it was a person, the warning shots had not scared them off. We put the fire out again, faster than before. Within seconds, the site was pitch black. The only light was a weak glow from the coals and some moonlight. We got into our tents with our rifles. I lay there wide awake. I could hear little sounds, branches shifting and leaves crunching, but I couldn't tell what was real. Then I heard footsteps, not walking, but running fast and hard around the tents and through the campsite. Something brushed the side of my tent, like a dragging scratch, like someone running an object along the fabric as they moved past. I didn't call out because I was terrified. All I'd be doing was getting the attention of whoever was out there. Then it went completely still. That silence was the worst part. A full minute passed before that scream exploded right in the middle of the campsite. It was so loud that it didn't sound human anymore. I heard Connor scream from his tent. I yelled too without meaning to. Then Kyle fired a shot through the roof of his tent into the air. The blast was deafening. Right after it, I heard fast footsteps tearing off through the woods. The footsteps got farther away until I couldn't hear a thing. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then Kyle shouted, asking if we were okay. Connor answered immediately in a shaky voice. I answered too. Kyle said we were all getting into one tent. We crawled into his tent because it was the biggest. The three of us sat there with rifles and flashlights, barely talking. At one point, Connor asked what the hell that was, and Kyle said he didn't know. Hours passed. Every so often, we would think we heard movement and go silent again. Eventually, the adrenaline wore off enough that we all drifted off. When morning came, nothing looked as bad as I expected. A couple of things were knocked over. One beer can was stepped on. A plastic tub was moved, but nothing was stolen. We packed up at dawn without even discussing hunting again. Nobody wanted to stay another night. We hiked back the way we came, talking more as we got closer to the truck, probably because being in motion made us feel less trapped. By the time we were on the road, some of the fear had turned into that weird laughter people have after something bad. Connor kept doing an impression of Kyle screaming into the woods and firing into the air like a Tusken Raider. Even Kyle laughed. We talked about whether we should call the sheriff. In the end, we didn't. Kyle said if it was really someone needing help, they would have answered us. Connor said it was probably some lunatic messing with hunters. I said it was maybe a woman on drugs trying to lure people into the dark. Both of our explanations were scary, and they felt like the easy assumptions. Truth be told, who knows what the actual explanation could have been. I got home that night exhausted and thought I would sleep good, but I woke up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat from a dream. In the dream, I was back in the woods alone, and I saw a woman standing between the trees. She was covered in blood, and she was screaming for help, and the way she looked right at me gave me chills. But I couldn't move toward her. I just stood there while she screamed and screamed until I woke up. I sat on the edge of my bed breathing hard, thinking about those 2 nights in the mountains, and wondering if my dream was a manifestation of subconscious guilt. What sticks with me most now is the possibility that somewhere in all that, there really had been a person out there, and we chose to hide from her. I still tell myself that if someone had truly needed help, they would have answered us. They would have come closer to the fire and said something. All 3 of us wonder if someone really needed help that night, or if something darker was going on. It is a question that will haunt us forever. The human mind has a way of trying to protect us from the things we cannot explain, but sometimes, those protections feel more like a prison of our own making. Every time I look at a tree line now, I don't just see trees and leaves. I see the potential for things that watch and wait. I hear the quiet footsteps in the leaves, and I remember the cold feeling of being completely exposed to a danger that didn't care about our warning shots or our weapons. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.